what is your most controversial take? Maybe juxtaposed against the betting market. Maybe it's juxtaposed against what you're hearing out there anecdotally, like, people seem to have too much love for this. Some of the answers that have come up: Niners to miss the playoffs, Patriots to make the playoffs. I'm curious, what is your most outlying opinion?
That's a good one. I go back and forth with the Denver Broncos because I look at the AFC and I think there's 6 or 7 really good teams. And there's about 4 teams that aren't particularly good, but they all have great coaches. Pittsburgh, New England, Tennessee, and Denver. And I think that at least one of those teams is going to make the playoffs. I know it was 2-1 a few, maybe a month ago for Denver. We've seen at least a little bit of movement on that number down to 180. Part of me looks at Russell Wilson and says, man, even with play action and even when he was clean last year, he was an average quarterback at best. So how much can Sean Payton really do? And then I look at, the last season, if you looked at the first 15 or so games, only 3 of them, Denver's opponents, gained over 20 points in a game. So how much does he actually have to move the needle to make this thing work out? So I'm back and forth there. I think by the time it's all said and done, I'll probably predict Denver, or I'll probably have Denver going to the playoffs. But then the question becomes, how many great teams are good teams, and how many miss, and how many of those teams' front offices and head coaches end up, being shown the door.
Yeah, I guess the follow-up to that is, how many teams fall under the category for you of having this wide variance in possible outcomes? Obviously, the Kansas City Chiefs, floor is going to be only, so low. The opposite, the Arizona Cardinals ceiling might only be so high. But what are the teams like the Broncos where you're like, you know what? It could go so vastly different. This sort of buttresses our point about alternate season win totals. I'm thinking in my head, just as some examples, the New York Giants, a lot of varying opinions on them, the Miami Dolphins. How many? Cite some for me, if you would.
Man, I think so. I think the Raiders, your hometown Raiders, have a relatively narrow distribution. I think the Cardinals have a relatively narrow distribution. I think once it's all said and done, everybody's giving lip service to the Rams and Buccaneers, but I think that those 2 teams, the party's over. I think there's a pretty narrow distribution on them. I think on the top end, you have Kansas City. I think you have Philadelphia, Dallas. And then I think everybody else is in this really wide distribution where you're better off betting alts than betting the actual season win total at something around -110.
Yeah.
And that's a crazy statement in the league because you look in the NFC, it's like Carolina, Atlanta, and New Orleans are all kind of middling teams, but they all have easy schedules. And we saw what happened last year in the NFC East when that occurred. You look at, the Giants and the Commanders, they all have tough schedules, right? And so if they're middling teams, then how does that go? If they fundamentally improve or their schedule gets worse, then we think they could be great. So it's probably 25 teams or so that are in this really wide distribution of possible outcomes. And, to me, that makes it fun, but it also makes it super hard because you're trying to, when you're betting, you're trying to pick positive EV wagers. And I think in a vacuum, for example, this is the playoffs out of the AFC, and you're making statements that kind of is Baltimore going to miss it? Is Cleveland going to miss it? Is Cincinnati? And it's there's a lot of teams that they have to leapfrog for that third and final wildcard spot if they don't, eclipse the Chiefs in the AFC West.
Let me ask you, what is your favorite alternate season win total, either to the over, to the under this year?
To me, I think it's a Seattle Seahawks wager, to your point. So they're currently 8.5, I think, where and juiced over. Honestly, anything 10.5, 11.5 to me. When you think about that NFC West, I think the Cardinals are dead on arrival this year. But actually it's 9.5, in some places as the screen is showing. But if you can go alternate 10.5, 11.5, because when you think about that division, it's a 2-team race. The Rams are 1 injury away from being almost as bad as the Cardinals. The Cardinals are bad, and I think intentionally so. And San Francisco, we all index on how great Brock Purdy played last year. But for the most part, the Niners since 2015 have either won enough games to go to the NFC Championship game or they've lost 10 or more games. And it almost always is a quarterback injury that is the precipitation for the 10-loss seasons. And last year they avoided that with Purdy and Garoppolo. Everybody's indexing on last year, but I think in general, like, quarterback uncertainty has actually hurt Kyle Shanahan teams more than it's helped them.
Is there? I'll ask you some of our greatest hits. I'll save most for after the break, but I'll ask you one here. Jordan Love. I've made the point that I think thinking he will stink is probably a bad instinct. But have we gotten to the point where perhaps in the same breath I say so many people seem to like Green Bay now that it almost seems almost too trendy? Where do you find them in your rankings?
I love the way you think on this. Like, so at 5-1 to win the division early in the markets, right? That was very clearly a bad price. 4-1, you're obviously moving that quite a bit. But at the same time, you know, it hasn't moved a ton, even though there's a lot of people in not only the media, but also, you know, the space that really like Green Bay. So there is clearly some resistance. You know, teams like Detroit, Minnesota, Chicago are balancing that out a little bit. So, yeah, that does give me pause, right? It is, as much as, you know, last year when we were bullish on Detroit, it's like, well, that win total went from 6 to 6.5 to 7. And you're like, okay, well, this makes sense. We all like Detroit, and the people with, you know, the sharp accounts like Detroit as well. Green Bay's been bet down a little bit, but it's not enough for me to be like, oh, this is a slam dunk bet for them to win the NFC North, for example.
Does week 1 of the preseason or anything preseason move your needle at all?
I think injuries obviously are big. We didn't get many this week, which was nice, especially for key contributors. The other one is, like, if a quarterback looks out of sorts, that is, to me, I'll at least give some credence to that. Now, this week we were lucky. Richardson had a bad pick, Stroud had a bad pick. For the most part, they looked like they belonged, at least. Like, the game didn't look too fast for them. But that's another thing that I'll always look at is, you know, does a quarterback look like Blake Bortles preseason, his rookie year was just like, this guy can't throw, you know, and you're like, okay, I guess we're gonna have to not buy into the Jags this year, and that's just one sticks in my head.
Yeah, Blake Bortles, who the Johnny Manziel documentary reminds us was the first quarterback taken the year that Manziel came out. I'm not sure if either was a rousing success, quite frankly. At least Bortles got them deep into the playoffs that one year, got to the AFC. Probably should have. Oh, they should have won that game.
He was a short ball away from making it to the Super Bowl.
Brutal for the Jaguars.
Yeah, he had 35 touchdowns or something in year 2. It wasn't great, but yeah, I mean, it was a mixed bag for him. But at least early, you just looked at the arm slot and you looked at the kind of skittishness in the pocket. You're like, I don't know, you know. And Chad Henne, Chiefs legend, 2-time Super Bowl champion, was starting over him, and even then, they went to Bortles almost immediately, and Bortles was terrible as a rookie. So it was just, you knew that Jacksonville team was not going to be particularly good.
Yeah, well, at least he did something. Johnny Football, of course, didn't in the NFL. All right, real quick because I want to get to your other takes, but just to clarify the Green Bay take. So you do like a Green Bay bet, which is?
Yeah, I mean, I'll take Green Bay all the way down to 3-1 to win that division.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that would be my number. I'd take over the 7.5, even juiced out to minus 150, minus 160 or so. That's to me, I think, where I like Green Bay. I wrote this in a tweet the other day, which to me, it's I think that Jordan Love will color between the lines much better than Aaron Rodgers was an artist last year. And Rodgers is maybe one of the best artists to ever play the game, but he kind of lost, you know, obviously when that goes poorly for Green Bay, it goes really poorly. It gets Mike McCarthy fired. It gets what happened last year. And I think Jordan Love is maybe not as creative as Rodgers will be, but I think from he'll hit that back foot and trust the Matt LaFleur offense, which I think is a little bit underrated.
Excellent analogy on that. Okay, I like that. Color between the lines, better than Aaron Rodgers was an artist last year. The conventional wisdom has the Niners and the Eagles, not necessarily in that order. Let's say Eagles and Niners. But those two teams as the cream of the crop of the NFC. From a betting standpoint, you don't quite see it that way.
No, I think, what really hurt the Cowboys last year, and I was very high on CeeDee Lamb, for Offensive Player of the Year and all lead the league in receiving yards. And obviously those bets didn't work. All of his overs hit, but he was the only receiving option that they had. And I know that they lose Kellen Moore, but I'm coming around to this idea that Brandon Cooks is going to be kind of the guy that unleashed the offense. When you don't have a deep threat that is okay with kind of a 0-for-0 game, that's just, run the defense off, make sure the safeties are occupied at all times. It really hurts your passing game. We saw Dalton Schultz. He was the franchise tag player for Dallas last year. He, didn't have a great year because there was no openings in the middle of the field for him. I think Brandon Cooks is going to turn that offense around quite a bit. I think Pollard, all the carries going to Pollard instead of Zeke. You have to see how he's going to work efficiency-wise. But I really like the Cowboys, Cowboys and Detroit, for example. I think those are the two teams that if you're looking at, Super Bowls out of the NFC, Philadelphia, is favored, and they should be, but you're losing both coordinators. You're losing Javon Hargrave. You're losing Salamalu, the guard. You also have A.J. Brown, who was very healthy last year. He's not been healthy all the time in his career. So I think I like the Eagles. I think they'll make the playoffs, but I think Dallas to win that division and Dallas to, come out of the NFC is a good play. And I also think that about Detroit. Like, I'm not going to bet Detroit anything kind of minus 110, so their win total, or even something like minus, plus 150, like the division odds-ish number there. But I will take them on long shots. I think that, Detroit, if everything comes together, can be very Philadelphia Eagles-like, where you're great on both offensive lines. The quarterback has a great play caller, Ben Johnson stays. And, you work off of that. And that has some really, fat tail elements to it in the NFC where, if we're not right about the Packers and if the Vikings regress and the Bears don't emerge to who they're supposed to be, they could run away with that division. And, if you run away with the division in the NFC, you could run away with the entire conference, given how mucky it is.
Yeah. Oh, boy. I do not want to live through a season where the Cowboys are that successful. That's for sure. So you had them both as NFC bets, a path for them to do very well in conference. I noticed that you did not say it to win the Super Bowl, however. What is your big take on that?
Yeah, I mean, for the Super Bowl, I look at Buffalo, and I think to myself, are we just all overlooking Buffalo? Now, there have been some perturbations. You've had injuries to Von Miller. You have, Leslie Frazier, who's been fantastic. He retires for a year at least, and they go with McDermott calling the plays. That might hurt him. McDermott's a top 5 coach in the NFL in terms of in-game decision-making. But this, to me, reminds me of the Colts, of the mid-2000s where, they go to New England 2 straight years. It's snowy. They lose to the Patriots. And then they lost at home to that Steelers team that was a 6 seed. Big Ben makes a huge tackle on the Bettis fumble. And everybody's like, the Colts just are a team that can't get over the hump. And I think Buffalo, obviously, you have the 13-second game. You have the snow in their home park. But, Cincinnati much more accustomed to it or better for it. And this is the team that's been the best team in the NFL the last 2 years. If you look at power ratings, you look at everything. The Bills were the best team in the league in 2021. They're the best team in the league last year, until Von Miller got hurt, at least. And everybody's kind of disregarding them a little bit in the minds of many. At 9-1, to me, this is a really good play. And I think Buffalo, they're coming out of a hard division with the Jets and the Dolphins and the Patriots all being strong contenders. I'm a big fan of Buffalo this year to go all the way and surprise some people in the way that the Colts did kind of in the middle of the last 2 decades ago.
Yeah, it's a good comp because it's Kansas City and Cincinnati in most people's minds, and certainly in the betting market as well out of the AFC. And the proverbial window does appear to be shutting. And maybe after this year it will shut some more. But yes, it's an interesting take on the Bills. We've had a wide opinion on them too. I think Mike Pritchard's hot take was he didn't think the Bills were going to be very good this year, right? Or as good as expected. So it's all over the place on that. Real quick before I let you go, because this has come up on the show, so I just wanted to throw it out at you, because you mentioned that you thought the Rams were going to be pretty defined this year as not so great. I'm paraphrasing. There's a couple people who made Stetson Bennett offensive rookie of the year plays in triple digits. 200 plus to 1 and then 150 to 1, I believe. There's a path, do you think? If the Rams, if
Stafford is the one of the 3 superstars on that team that gets hurt, and he can funnel 150 targets, to Cooper Kupp, 200 targets to Cooper Kupp, yeah, he could look good. He looked good the other day.
What about besides hurt? What about, we're just not going to be very good this year. We're going to sit Matthew Stafford.
Could be. I mean, that's why it's 100. It's more than 100 to 1.
Yeah.
Because the path is very thin. But if it happens, he's a quarterback, so you can certainly.
He's a quarterback. That's the whole point of the conversation. He's a quarterback. Eric, great talking to you, man. Great seeing you. Appreciate it.
Of course, this has been fun.
Eric Eager, Dr. Eric Eager from Sumer Sports, host of the Sumer Sports Show.
Go to VSiN.com/subscribe to become a VSiN Pro subscriber today.